Marcus Kane had built his life around silence. For 12 years, the only sounds that mattered were the creak of his porch swing, the whisper of wind through dead grass, and the distant lowing of cattle that required nothing from him but feed and water. His ranch sat like a forgotten island in the vast New Mexico territory, miles from the nearest settlement, exactly how he preferred it. The scars on his hands told the story of a man who'd once built things. Bridges, buildings, a life that mattered. But the scars on his soul ran deeper, carved by memories of a burning homestead and the screams of people he'd failed to protect. His wife Elena. His twin boys, barely old enough to walk. The Apache raid that had taken everything in a single blood-soaked morning had left him with a choice: join the endless cycle of revenge that consumed most men, or disappear entirely. He'd chosen disappearance. Built this ranch with his own hands, stone by stone, beam by beam. Created a fortress of solitude where the ghosts of his past could rest undisturbed. The nearest town was Copper Creek, a hard day's ride through unforgiving terrain. He made the trip twice a year for supplies, speaking only when necessary, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might recognize the haunted look of a man carrying too much history. Tonight, as autumn storms gathered on the horizon, Marcus sat on his porch cleaning his rifle. Not because he expected trouble had learned to avoid Marcus Kane. But because routine was the only thing standing between him and the kind of madness that swallowed men whole. The weapon was an old friend, a Winchester that had seen him through the war and the dark years after. He knew every groove in its stock, every quirk of its mechanism. The first rumble of thunder made his cattle restless. He could hear them shifting in the darkness, sensing the storm's approach with the instinct of creatures who understood that survival meant reading the signs nature provided. Marcus understood that language too. Had learned it the hard way, through nights when the difference between life and death was measured in seconds and the ability to see danger coming before it arrived. As lightning split the sky, illuminating the empty landscape in stark black and white, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A prickling sensation at the base of his skull, the same warning that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. Something was different tonight. Something was coming. He stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of stillness. At 45, he was still strong, still capable, but the years of isolation had aged him in ways that went beyond mere time. His beard was more gray than black now, his eyes permanently narrowed from scanning horizons for threats that might never come. But his hands were steady, his reflexes sharp, honed by 12 years of living alone in a land that killed the careless. The storm was moving fast, bringing with it the kind of rain that turned dry arroyos into raging torrents and washed away anything foolish enough to stand in its path. Marcus had seen flash floods tear through this country like the wrath of God, carrying away boulders the size of houses. He'd positioned his ranch carefully, on high ground that would remain safe even if the world below turned to churning mud. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, Marcus made his final preparations for the night. Secured the barn, checked the generator, ensured his emergency supplies were within easy reach. 12 years of this routine had made it automatic, a dance of survival performed without conscious thought. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the ritual felt like preparation for something more than just another storm. The wind picked up, carrying with it scents that made his nostrils flare. Smoke from a distant fire. The metallic tang of blood on the air. And something else, something that made every instinct scream danger. Marcus Kane had survived this long by trusting those instincts, by understanding that in a land where death rode the wind, the man who ignored the warnings was the man who died first. He was about to discover that some warnings came not as enemies, but as desperate souls seeking shelter from a storm far more dangerous than the one raging overhead. The knocking came at the worst possible moment. Marcus had just settled into his chair by the fire when the sound cut through the storm like an axe through wood. Not the tentative rap of a neighbor seeking shelter, but the urgent, desperate pounding of someone who understood that seconds mattered. Marcus froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Nobody came to his ranch. Not ever. The isolation wasn't an accident, it was carefully constructed, maintained through years of deliberate unfriendliness toward anyone who might consider him a neighbor. The nearest homestead was 15 miles away, and the Henderson family knew better than to make social calls on Marcus Kane. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by voices that spoke in a language that made his blood run cold. Apache words, spoken with the urgency of people who had nowhere else to go. Marcus set down his cup with hands that trembled slightly, muscle memory flooding back from a time when hearing that language meant death was riding hard behind it. Through the heavy oak door, he could hear them more clearly now. Multiple voices, all women, speaking in the rapid, hushed tones of people who understood that noise meant danger. One voice rose above the others, switching to English with an accent that carved each word from stone. "We know someone lives here. Please, we need help. Just for tonight." Marcus stood slowly, his rifle within easy reach but his hand not quite touching it. 12 years of solitude had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming conflicting messages. Danger from whatever had driven these women to his door. But also something else, something that sounded almost like hope? He approached the door with the careful steps of a man who'd learned that survival often depended on split-second decisions. Through the thick wood, he could hear them breathing, sense their presence like heat against his skin. How many? 5? 7? Enough to overwhelm him if they were armed, if this was some kind of trap. But warriors didn't usually announce themselves by knocking. And the tone in that voice, there was something in it that reminded him of Elena, of the way she'd sounded when she'd begged him to take the boys and run while she held off the raiders. Desperate, determined, but not defeated. "Who are you?" he called through the door, his voice rougher than he'd intended. 12 years of speaking mostly to himself had left him unpracticed at human conversation. "My name is Ayana," came the reply, closer now, as if the speaker had pressed herself against the wood. "These are my daughters, my sisters. We have been running for 4 days. The men hunting us, they are not far behind." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Men hunting Apache women through the territory meant only one thing, either renegades who'd broken from the reservation, or something worse. Something that would bring the full weight of the cavalry down on anyone foolish enough to help them. "How many men?" he asked. 6. Maybe 7. They wear the uniforms of soldiers, but they are not soldiers. They are something else. Something that hunts for pleasure, not duty. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd known men like that during the war, men who'd discovered that violence could be its own reward. Men who'd learned to enjoy the power that came with a uniform and a gun. The kind of men who gave real soldiers a bad name and left atrocities in their wake. Another voice joined the first, younger, more frightened. "They killed our men. All of them. They burned our homes and told us to run so they could hunt us like animals." Marcus pressed his palm against the door, feeling the vibration of their voices through the wood. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak, rain hammering against the shutters like bullets. If these women had been running for 4 days in this weather, they were beyond desperate. They were dying. "Please," Ayana said again, and this time he heard something that made his decision for him. Not just desperation, but the kind of controlled fury that came from watching everything you loved destroyed. He'd heard that tone before, in his own voice, in the dark days after the raid that had taken his family. The iron bar that secured his door felt heavier than it should have. Marcus had installed it himself, forged it from steel that could stop a charging horse. In 12 years, he'd never removed it for anyone. But as thunder crashed overhead and rain poured down like tears from an angry sky, he found himself lifting it from its brackets. The door swung open, revealing a sight that would change everything. 7 Apache women stood huddled on his porch, their traditional clothing torn and muddy, some bearing wounds that painted dark stains against wet fabric. But it was their eyes that struck him most, not the beaten look of victims, but the hard gleam of survivors who'd seen hell and walked out the other side. Ayana stood slightly apart from the others, her chin raised despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She was perhaps 30, with the kind of beauty that survived hardship and became something stronger. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, but her gaze held his without flinching. "Thank you," she said simply, and Marcus stepped aside to let them enter his sanctuary. He had no way of knowing that in opening his door, he'd just invited war itself to take shelter under his roof. They moved like ghosts entering his home, silent despite their exhaustion. Marcus had forgotten how small his ranch house felt with other people in it. For 12 years, it had been his fortress, his refuge from a world that had taken everything. Now it seemed to shrink around these women who brought with them the scent of rain and fear and something else, the metallic smell of blood that wasn't entirely their own. The youngest couldn't have been more than 15, clutching a bundle that moved slightly against her chest. A baby, Marcus realized, its breathing shallow in the cold night air. The oldest had silver threading through her black hair and eyes that had seen too much death. But it was Ayana who commanded the room, even in her bedraggled state. "We cannot stay long," she said, helping the others settle near his fireplace. "They will find our trail at first light. We needed shelter from the storm, time to tend our wounds, nothing more." Marcus bolted the door behind them, though he knew it was probably useless now. His sanctuary had been breached, not by force but by choice, and there would be consequences. There always were. "Tell me about the men hunting you," he said, moving to his window to peer through the shutters. The storm was beginning to weaken, and with it, the cover that had protected them this far. Ayana's jaw tightened. "They came to our village 5 days ago. Said they were looking for renegades who'd left the reservation. But there were no renegades. Only families trying to survive winter." One of the other women, older, with deep lines around her eyes, spoke up. They wore uniforms, but they were not acting under orders. The leader, he had dead eyes. The kind of man who kills because he enjoys it. What did they want? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. At first, they said they were searching for weapons. Then they said they were looking for stolen cattle. But when they started separating the women from the men, when they started looking at us like we were prey. Ayana's voice trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Marcus felt something dark and familiar rise in his chest. The same cold rage that had sustained him through 12 years of isolation. He'd encountered men like this before, during the war and after. Men who'd learned to use authority as a weapon, who discovered that in remote places, far from oversight, they could become gods of their own small, brutal kingdoms. How many did they kill? He asked. All the men. Every one. The woman holding the baby spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. My husband tried to stop them from taking me. They shot him down like a dog. Then they laughed. The baby made a weak sound, and Marcus saw how pale its lips were. Hypothermia, exposure, too many hours in the cold rain. If they didn't get the child warmed soon, it wouldn't survive the night. There are blankets in the bedroom, he said, pointing toward the back of the house. Take what you need. I'll build up the fire. As he worked, feeding wood to the flames, Marcus found himself studying these women with new eyes. They weren't the broken refugees he'd expected. Despite their exhaustion, despite their wounds, they moved with purpose. They tended each other's injuries with practiced efficiency, organized themselves without discussion, kept watch without being asked. These weren't just survivors. They were something else entirely. You're not helpless, he said to Ayana as she cleaned blood from her forehead. Her eyes met his, and he saw a flicker of something that might have been respect. Would helpless women have survived 4 days in this country with armed men hunting them? Marcus felt the pieces clicking together. You've been leading them away from the village. Drawing the pursuit. The children and elders, they went north to the reservation. These men, they followed the trail we left for them. South, toward the desert. Toward places where hunters can become the hunted. The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. You're not running from them. You're leading them. Ayana's smile was sharp as broken glass. For 4 days, we have been rabbits. Tonight, we become wolves. Outside, the storm was dying, and with it, the cover that had protected them. But Marcus was beginning to understand that these women hadn't stumbled onto his ranch by accident. They'd chosen this ground, this night, this storm. They'd brought their war to his doorstep because they knew exactly what kind of man he used to be. What do you need from me? He asked. Before Ayana could answer, the sound of horses reached them through the dying wind. Riders moving carefully through the mud, spreading out to surround the house. Professional hunters who thought they had their prey trapped. Marcus checked his rifle, ensuring a round was chambered. How many? 7, Ayana replied, and he noticed she was no longer the desperate refugee who'd begged at his door. She stood differently now, her posture straight and commanding. Led by a man who calls himself Sergeant Briggs. He likes to make women watch while he kills their men. Then he likes to take his time with what comes after. The baby's cry was weak but insistent. The young mother tried to soothe it, but the sound carried in the still air. Outside, Marcus heard a horse whinny softly, and knew their pursuers had heard it too. They know we're here, he said. Good, Ayana replied, and Marcus saw steel glinting in her hands. Let them come. They expect to find frightened women who will beg for mercy. They're about to learn that some hunts end with the hunter becoming the prey. Sergeant Briggs had been hunting Apache for 3 months, and he'd learned to read the signs. 7 women, moving fast but not randomly. They'd been leading him on a chase through some of the most unforgiving country in the territory, always staying just ahead of his men, always leaving just enough trail to follow. But tonight, the trail had led to this isolated ranch, and Briggs smiled as he studied the building through the rain. Perfect. Isolated, defensible, with nowhere to run. The women had finally made a mistake, trapped themselves in a box canyon of their own making. Spread out, he ordered his men, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. Henderson, take the back. Morrison, watch the east side. Nobody leaves this building alive. Private Wilson, the youngest of his squad, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Sergeant, shouldn't we report this to the fort? Follow proper procedures? Briggs's laugh was ugly. Son, we are the procedures out here. These women are dangerous renegades who've been raiding settlements. Our job is to stop them, permanently. It was a lie, and Wilson knew it. But Wilson was green, barely 18, and he'd learned not to question Sergeant Briggs too closely. The other men had learned the same lesson, through methods that left no official record but plenty of unofficial scars. As they approached the ranch house, Briggs felt the familiar excitement building in his chest. The thrill of the hunt reaching its climax, the moment when prey realized it had nowhere left to run. He'd perfected this dance over the past months, refined it into an art form that left no witnesses and no evidence. The official reports would tell of a tragic but necessary confrontation with hostile Apache. The unofficial reality was something else entirely, a hunting party that had discovered that in the vast emptiness of the territory, men with guns and authority could become their own law. Remember, Briggs called to his men, these women are armed and dangerous. Approach with caution, but don't hesitate to defend yourselves. The code words were understood. Take no prisoners. Leave no witnesses. The territory was full of isolated graves that would never be found, never be questioned. But as they drew closer to the ranch house, Briggs noticed something that made him frown. No lights in the windows. No sign of movement. For women who'd been running for 4 days, they were remarkably quiet. Something's wrong, muttered Corporal Hayes, the most experienced tracker in the squad. This doesn't feel right. Briggs dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. They're exhausted, scared. Probably huddled together praying to whatever gods they think are listening. But Hayes's instincts were correct. Inside the ranch house, Marcus Kane was discovering that his unexpected guests were far more than they appeared. Ayanna had positioned her women throughout the building with military precision, each one armed with weapons they'd concealed beneath their traditional clothing. The tall one with the beard, Ayanna whispered, pointing through a gap in the shutters. That's Briggs. He was there when they killed my brother. The one by the barn, that's Hayes. He held my sister while Briggs. She didn't finish the sentence. Marcus felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. The same killing calm that had gotten him through the war, through the dark years after. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were predators in uniform, and predators understood only one language. How do you want to do this? He asked. Briggs will come through the front door. He always does, wants to see the fear in his victim's eyes. His men will spread out, but they expect to find women too frightened to fight and maybe one sympathetic rancher. She handed him something small and bright, a piece of polished metal that would catch the firelight. When you see this signal, that's when we show them what Apache women can do. Outside, Briggs was growing impatient. The storm had passed, but the silence from the ranch house was unnerving. No crying, no pleading, no sounds of women preparing to surrender. Just an ominous quiet that made his skin crawl. Maybe they're not here, Wilson suggested hopefully. Maybe they moved on. The tracks lead right to the door, Briggs snapped. 7 women, moving fast, some of them bleeding. They're in there, and so is whoever was stupid enough to help them. He drew his revolver, checking the cylinder out of habit. 6 shots, more than enough for a rancher who'd made the mistake of showing mercy to Apache renegades. The official report would be simple: tragic confrontation with hostile natives, civilian casualty caught in the crossfire. We do this clean, he announced to his men. No witnesses, no survivors. Questions? There were none. There never were. These men had learned to follow orders without thinking too deeply about consequences. It was easier that way, safer. In the vast emptiness of the territory, conscience was a luxury that could get a man killed. Briggs approached the front door, his men taking positions around the building. Professional soldiers executing a textbook assault on what they believed was a building full of frightened women and maybe one civilian who'd made a fatal error in judgment. They were about to discover that some errors were theirs to make. As Briggs raised his boot to kick in the door, he had no way of knowing that inside, Marcus Kane was remembering skills he'd hoped never to use again. Or that 7 Apache women were about to teach him the difference between hunting prey and hunting predators. The door exploded inward, and Sergeant Briggs stepped into his own carefully constructed trap. The door splintered under Briggs's boot, and he burst into the ranch house with his revolver drawn and ready. But instead of finding cowering women, he found himself staring down the barrel of Marcus Kane's Winchester, held by a man whose eyes had gone dead calm. For a split second, confusion flickered across Briggs's face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Where were the screaming women? Where was the terrified rancher begging for mercy? This gray-bearded man with the steady hands and cold eyes looked like someone who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. That moment of hesitation was all Ayanna needed. The polished metal flashed in the firelight, sending a signal to positions throughout the house. What happened next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Apache women struck like shadows given form, moving with the silent efficiency of predators who'd been planning this moment for days. Hayes, positioned by the barn, felt a whisper of movement behind him and turned just in time to see a knife sliding between his ribs. He opened his mouth to scream, but only blood came out. Morrison, watching the east side of the house, heard something that might have been a footstep in the mud. He spun around, rifle raised, and found himself face to face with the oldest of the Apache women. Her eyes held no mercy, no hesitation, only the cold purpose of someone collecting a debt long overdue. "This is for my grandson," she whispered, her blade finding the gap between his ribs and his heart. Inside the house, Briggs was finally beginning to understand that he'd walked into a trap. The rancher with the rifle was just one part of a carefully orchestrated ambush. As his men died in the darkness outside, he realized that for months, he'd been hunting wolves while believing they were sheep. "You made a mistake," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced death and survived. "You hunted the wrong women." Briggs tried to bring his revolver to bear, but Ayanna appeared beside him like a ghost, her knife pressed against his throat. "Move and you die," she said simply. "Though you're going to die anyway. The only question is how much you'll suffer first." Outside, the sounds of dying men carried on the night air. Not the sharp crack of gunfire, but the wet, desperate sounds of men who discovered they weren't the apex predators they'd believed themselves to be. Wilson, the youngest of Briggs's squad, was pressed against the side of the barn, his rifle shaking in his hands. He'd heard Hayes cry out, then nothing. Morrison had simply vanished. The other men were scattered around the property, but none of them were responding to his whispered calls. "Sarge," he called out, his voice cracking with fear. "Sarge, what's happening?" Inside the house, Briggs was learning the answer to that question. Ayanna had positioned herself where he could see her clearly, her knife steady against his throat. But it was her eyes that terrified him, not the wild look of a desperate animal, but the cold calculation of a hunter who'd cornered her prey. "You remember my village," she said, her voice conversational. 5 days ago. You told us to run so you could hunt us like animals." Briggs's mouth was dry, his tongue feeling like leather. "You're Apache. You were off the reservation illegally. We were families trying to survive winter. Old people, children, mothers with babies. But you saw something else, didn't you? You saw sport." The knife pressed a little deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. Briggs felt his control slipping, the confident authority he'd worn like armor cracking under the weight of his own mortality. "My husband tried to protect me," Ayanna continued. "You shot him down like a dog. Then you laughed. Do you remember laughing?" Outside, Wilson was discovering that the night had teeth. He'd heard something moving in the darkness, something that didn't sound like his fellow soldiers. When he turned toward the sound, he found himself staring into the face of the woman who'd been carrying the baby. She was no longer the frightened refugee he'd glimpsed earlier. Her eyes held the same cold purpose he'd seen in Ayanna's, the same deadly calculation. In her hands was a knife that gleamed with more than just moonlight. "Please," Wilson whispered, his rifle forgotten. "I didn't want to do this. I tried to tell the sergeant we should report to the fort, follow proper procedures." The woman studied him for a long moment, her blade steady. "You were there when they killed my husband. You watched while they burned our homes. I'm just a private. I follow orders. And now you'll follow one more." The knife moved with surgical precision, and Wilson discovered that some orders came from higher authorities than the United States Army. Inside the house, Briggs was facing his own judgment. The rancher with the rifle had moved closer, and up close, Briggs could see the scars on the man's hands, the way he held the weapon with the casual familiarity of someone who'd used it many times before. "You hunted women and children," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "I know men like you. I've killed men like you." Briggs tried to summon his authority, the confident swagger that had served him so well. "You're interfering with a military operation. That's treason." Ayanna's laugh was sharp as her blade. "Military operation? Is that what you call murder and rape?" The knife moved again, and Briggs felt his world narrowing to the point of steel against his throat. Around him, the ranch house had become a courtroom where justice wore a different face than he'd expected. "You wanted to hunt," Ayanna said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Now you know what it feels like to be prey." The ranch house had become a temple of justice, and Ayanna was its high priestess. Briggs knelt in the center of the room, his hands bound behind his back with strips torn from his own uniform. The confident predator who'd kicked in the door was gone, replaced by a man who'd finally understood that actions had consequences. Around him, the Apache women had gathered in a circle, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Each one bore the marks of their ordeal, cuts, bruises, the hollow-eyed look of people who'd seen too much. But there was something else in their expressions now, something that made Briggs's blood run cold. Satisfaction. The deep, primal satisfaction of hunters who'd finally cornered their prey. "You killed 17 people in our village," Ayanna said, her voice carrying the weight of a formal accusation. 12 men, 3 women, 2 children. You burned our homes, scattered our families, turned us into refugees in our own land." Briggs tried to speak, to summon the authority he'd wielded so carelessly. "I was following orders. Apache raiders were reported in the area. Whose orders? Marcus asked, his rifle still trained on the sergeant. Show me the paperwork. Show me the official authorization to massacre families. The silence stretched like a taut wire. They all knew the truth, there were no orders, no official sanction. Just a group of men who'd discovered that in the vast emptiness of the territory, they could become gods of their own brutal kingdom. You hunted us for sport, said the woman who'd been carrying the baby. Made us run so you could chase us like animals. But animals don't plan. Animals don't set traps. Animals don't turn the hunt back on the hunters. Outside, the night was finally quiet. The last of Briggs's men had learned what the Apache women were capable of when cornered. Only Wilson remained alive, tied to a post in the barn, his face pale with the shock of survival. That boy, Ayanna said, following Marcus's gaze toward the barn. He's different from the others. Younger. Scared. He tried to stop you, didn't he? Tried to make you follow proper procedures. Briggs's jaw tightened. He's a soldier. He follows orders. No, Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. He's a witness. The one person who can testify to what really happened in that village. That's why you were going to kill him too. The pieces were falling into place. The massacre, the hunt, the plan to eliminate every witness. It wasn't random violence, it was a carefully orchestrated cover-up designed to hide atrocities that would have ended careers and resulted in hangings. How many other villages? Ayanna asked, her knife appearing in her hand like a conjurer's trick. How many other families did you destroy? Briggs's silence was answer enough. The Apache women exchanged glances, and Marcus saw something pass between them. A decision being made without words, the kind of wordless communication that came from shared suffering and shared purpose. In our tradition, Ayanna said, addressing Briggs directly, justice is not about punishment. It's about balance. You took 17 lives. You destroyed families. You scattered children to the wind. How do we balance that scale? The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus found himself remembering his own family, his own loss, the endless nights when he dreamed of finding the men responsible and making them pay. But revenge was a poison that consumed the seeker as surely as the sought. You could turn him over to the authorities, he suggested. Let the army court-martial him. Ayanna shook her head. The authorities made him. Gave him a uniform and a gun and told him to keep the peace. When men like this disappear, they write reports about hostile Apache and dangerous territories. They don't investigate. They don't ask questions. She was right, and they all knew it. In the vast emptiness of the territory, justice was whatever the strong decided it was. The weak had no recourse, no appeal, no protection except what they could create for themselves. Then what? Marcus asked. The oldest of the Apache women stepped forward. Her name was Nailnish, and she carried the authority of someone who'd lived through decades of war and loss. In the old days, we had a ceremony. For men who violated the sacred laws, who brought shame to their people. We would strip them of their identity, their belonging, their connection to the human world. She knelt beside Briggs, studying his face with the detached interest of someone examining an interesting specimen. You wear the uniform of a soldier, but you are not a soldier. You carry the authority of law, but you are not lawful. You claim to serve order, but you bring only chaos. Her knife moved with practiced precision, cutting away the insignia from Briggs's uniform. Stripes, badges, buttons, all the symbols of rank and authority fell to the floor like shed skin. You are no longer Sergeant Briggs, she pronounced. You are no longer a soldier. You are no longer a man with a name and a place in the world. You are nothing but a warning to others who might follow your path. Marcus watched in fascination as the ceremony continued. The Apache women moved around Briggs in a ritual dance, each one contributing to the process of stripping away his identity. Not just his uniform, but his sense of self, his connection to the world he'd known. It was more complete than death, more final than execution. They were erasing him from existence, turning him into a ghost who walked among the living. Now, Ayanna said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, you will walk into the desert. You will carry water for 1 day. You will have no horse, no weapons, no way to call for help. You will walk until you die, and when you die, no one will mourn you because no one will remember your name. It was exile, banishment, erasure. A fate worse than death because it offered the slim possibility of survival while ensuring that survival would be meaningless. As they prepared to release Briggs into the desert, Marcus felt something settle in his chest. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but something deeper. Balance, as Ayanna had said. The scales finding their equilibrium. Dawn came slowly to the New Mexico territory, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to mock the violence of the night before. Marcus stood on his porch, watching as the Apache women prepared to leave his ranch. They moved with the same silent efficiency they'd shown in battle, gathering their few possessions and tending to their wounded. Briggs was gone, sent into the desert with nothing but the clothes on his back and a single canteen of water. The other soldiers lay buried in shallow graves that would never be found, their bodies returned to the earth they desecrated with their presence. Only Wilson remained, tied in the barn and guarded by the oldest of the Apache women. "What will you do with him?" Marcus asked as Ayanna joined him on the porch. She studied the barn for a long moment before answering. "He is young. Scared. He tried to do the right thing, even when it was dangerous. Perhaps there is hope for him yet." "You're going to let him live?" "We're going to give him a choice. He can ride back to his fort and tell them that Sergeant Briggs and his men were killed by Apache raiders. He can file a report, collect his pay, and forget this ever happened. Or he can tell the truth. About what Briggs really was, what he really did. About the massacre, the hunt, the cover-up. He can be the witness who brings justice to the other families who've suffered." Marcus understood the choice being offered. Wilson could take the easy path, the safe path, the path that would protect his career and his future. Or he could choose the harder road, the one that would make him enemies but might prevent future atrocities. "What do you think he'll choose?" Ayanna's smile was sad but hopeful. "I think he's already chosen. He's been awake all